Hello, welcome to this week's edition of the Academy. Today we're going to wrap up Liddell Hart's 8 Maxims of Strategy. We've already covered all 8 maxims, but what I wanted to do was take advantage of a little bit of extra information that he included in this chapter 20. Now remember, it's chapter 20 within the second edition, okay, from 1967. So if you have a different version, the chapter numbering might be off, but it's a short chapter with the 8 maxims summarized. But he has a closing summary that I think has some points that are worth discussing. So before we get into the reading, I do want to thank you for watching the video and joining me, sticking through this. If you'd go ahead, you like what you see, go ahead and like the video, share if you want, subscribe please, and you'll be able to click the notification bell to find out when the next videos I upload are. Alright, so let's go ahead and read basically from his conclusion, if you will, of this chapter on the 8 maxims. So, now the essential truth underlying these maxims is that for success, 2 major problems must be solved: dislocation and exploitation. One precedes and one follows the actual blow, which in comparison is a simple act. You cannot hit the enemy with effect unless you have first created the opportunity, and you cannot make that effect decisive unless you exploit the second opportunity that comes before he can recover. Right. Now, the importance of these 2 problems has never been adequately recognized, a fact which goes far to explain the common indecisiveness of warfare. The training of armies is primarily devoted to developing efficiency in the detailed execution of the attack. This concentration on tactical technique tends to obscure the psychological element. It fosters a cult of soundness rather than of surprise. It breeds commanders who are so intent not to do anything wrong according to the book that they forget the necessity of making the enemy do something wrong. The result is that their plans have no result, for in war it is by compelling mistakes that the scales are most often turned. Okay, so there's a little bit more to that chapter, but that's the key nugget I wanted to kind of bring up. Now, you have to consider the fact that Liddell is coming from a perspective espousing this concept of the indirect attack. It's not going, up against the main body of the opponent in some sort of decisive, what do you call it? What kind of engagement is it? Decisive set piece match. You want to, dislocate the opponent, and then you want to exploit, right? So if you think about the different maxims, there's 3 that kind of relate really well. One is, do not basically follow the least point or the path of least resistance, or course of least resistance. The other is the direction of least expectation. And then kind of almost to reinforce that from the negative side is don't attack where your opponent is guarded or prepared, right? So why this is important is that oftentimes we are just used to, in our gaming situation, just throwing down models and just going at it. In fact, our games are pretty much that central portion of a real engagement. You've got the initial prelude, the dislocation stuff that happens, then you got the main battle, and then you got the exploitation. But just as he's mentioned in previous maxims about how you apply these things to strategy, you can also apply them to tactics. Let's think about how we can actually bring this concept down into the actual tactical situation on the tabletop. That means, basically, that what you're going to try to do is dislocate the opponent within the game, and then land the blow, hopefully disrupting him such that you'll be able to exploit whatever victory is there. Right? Remember about his planning comments where you need to be prepared for the success, the failure, and the partial success, right? So, let's kind of look at this in the context of these 3 phases in the battle. When your opponent's laid out his forces, you see what you've got to face. You might know what he has coming in reserve, waiting in reserve, potentially. And you have a plan of some sort to address this. Now, hopefully that plan is not just going to be run up there and move in and destroy, engage and destroy. It's going to have a little more thought to it, hopefully. Now, some of the ways you'll try to do this is to actually move your opponent out of different positions where he's maybe more strong, such as where he's in cover, Let's say he's in a particular fortress or behind some fortifications, whether it's a trench or a bunker or whatever. You might need to draw him out, or in all actuality, not every bunker has a full field of fire, so you might need to move your guys into a position where he does not get field of fire. So he may need to abandon that position so that he could reorient his firepower, right? Dislocation, right? During that dislocation time, that's when you land your blow, and hopefully he's disrupted enough where he can't coordinate his defense, and his line starts to suffer more than yours. During that time, you'll hopefully open up something, an opportunity in that. But then you need to be ready to exploit it with something that can capitalize on that, whether it's something fast or something strong or whatever. It needs to be something you're always considering. So that is how it kind of applies. That concept applies on the tabletop itself. Each turn, if you will, is a microcosm of the larger battle that's supposedly happening out there on either end of the table, extending in both directions, right? So within your locality, you're trying to make those opportunities happen by moving your opponent out of position, hitting him when he's vulnerable, and then taking advantage of any headway you gain. And so the second aspect that he tries to cover is, I guess he's politely railing on kind of the way military theory is taught in the military of his day. And it's probably not that much different now, but I don't know that for sure. What he's trying to highlight is there's a tendency to focus on the how do you use your weapon systems, your units, your organizations, your logistics, everything. How do you use all that? What's the proper way to do it? Now, the point he's trying to make is that because of that focus, you're kind of training yourself in an inadvertent way here to only think in those terms. So there's an enemy, position, your unit, whatever. You know how to use your units to go after them and defeat them. Well, the problem is the training is so focused on that aspect that oftentimes we lose sight of, or it becomes secondary in the back of our mind. We may not even remember it. That we actually have this other component that he calls it psychological, and I kind of see where he's coming from with that. But where we need to try to do things to cause the opponent to make mistakes, which give us something to exploit, right? And turn the tables on them. So let's kind of translate that to the tabletop, because I really do think this applies. There's a lot, especially when a new system comes out, a new game comes out, or even a new update to a game comes out. There's this big emphasis on how do you use the units most effectively, and what have there's a matchup. Everybody does matchups. This unit is great against this, and this unit use it this way. It's all about how do you use the unit. It's the same problem that he's talking about in the real world actually does apply in these war games that we do, right? So I'm going to posit here that we should actually kind of take a step back from that. When we find ourselves thinking in terms of how do I use my unit to accomplish, to which unit do I go after, how do I use it, what loadout do I put on, all these kind of things. Stop, step back, remind yourself that there's more to it than just the math, the dice rolls, the statistics, the rules. There's a psychological element. There are ways that you need to think about engaging your opponent so that they make mistakes. It's no different on the tabletop. The player who makes the most mistakes is likely to lose. Now, yes, every game system has ways to build your armies in such a way where the two armies can be lopsided. No different than the real world, okay? So, there's really no excuses here. You have to remember that what you're facing on the tabletop is a very calm, peaceful version of what is faced in the reality of combat by the real generals, the real colonels, the real majors. So, look at the tabletop that you're about to fight on, and don't just think in terms of how do I attack this particular unit? How do I deal with this unit, this position, this whatever? Think in terms of, okay, how can I minimize the effectiveness of that through maneuver, deception, or anything else you can come up with? There might be special rules you have. Who knows? And it could literally be some of the weapon systems you have. But if you only focus on using your weapon systems to deal with a particular threat, you're limiting yourself. Remember, a lot of games, weapons have range. If you can stay out of the opponent's weapon range, you have just defeated that unit. It is not effective. In order for it to bring its guns to bear, it needs to move. You've just dislocated that opponent's unit, right? So this is a very complex thing, war, okay? These tabletop games do actually mirror that complexity in a much more simplistic way, but still there is a lot of that complexity. And because there's a human element, you have an opponent who's running things, that possibility of inducing him to make mistakes is always there. And so we need to always remind ourselves to keep thinking that your first role as an opponent is to make your opponent make the mistakes so that you can use your units the way they're supposed to by the book to exploit that mistake and then win. Okay, so that's how I'm going to kind of wrap up Liddell Hart's book on strategy. Okay, I do encourage you to get yourself a copy, especially if you're a history buff. It's one of those cool books because it covers all of military history. Granted, he's trying to showcase why he thinks his approach, of indirect approach, is really a good way to do things. But it's really neat to kind of read through the history and see how things actually occurred, how they broke down, through the course of history. It's really neat. This particular edition, I don't know which editions have it, but this one actually has an appendix with a letter from one of the commanders who was actually out in the Western Africa, in the desert, World War II. He's actually writing to Liddell, telling him kind of how these theories that he's kind of pushing out there and saying this is the way things should be done, these make sense. They actually played out, and the proof, if you will, of the validity of what Liddell is putting out here in his book are evidenced throughout the North African campaign. And he's actually fair in his assessment that he shows how both sides used that same concept of the indirect approach to accomplish what was accomplished during that entire desert warfare period. Okay, so anyway, just if you're a history buff, it's really great. If you're not, there are plenty of places to get just the 8 maxims themselves online. I'll see if I can put a couple down there in the links below, or the description below. That way, you at least get, you can put all these on a 3x5 note card, just kind of in your rule book, just to kind of remind you of these things. Why not, So, but find them. If you can, just get a summary. It's simple, and I think you'll get a lot out of it just having that on hand. So, thank you very much for sticking with me through this series on Liddell Hart's book called Strategy, and I hope to see you in the next edition of the Academy. All right, thanks. Bye-bye.